Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Barbara Yon, and I am the Chief Science Officer at the COPD Foundation. On behalf of the COPD Foundation, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, there are just a couple of housekeeping notes. Today's program will have a question and answer session during which you'll be able to have questions answered by our expert speakers. Please note that your telephone lines are automatically muted and you'll need to send us your questions using the Q&A feature of the webinar. So you will type your questions in down in the area that is located on the bottom right-hand side of your computer screen. This call is being recorded, and we will let you know where you can access that recording in the coming weeks. Now let's get started. Next slide, please. Today, our panel is 3 people with a lot of expertise and experience in COPD. I'm Barbara Yon, as I said. I'm a longtime clinical researcher studying how to improve respiratory care in both rural and primary care settings. I'm also a family physician. And as I mentioned, I am the Chief Science Officer of the COPD Foundation. Our next presenter is Dr. Richard Malarski. He leads the health services research in the area of obstructive lung disease, palliative care, and delivery science at Kaiser Permanente Center for Health Services Research in Portland, Oregon. He practices pulmonary and critical care medicine as a senior physician for Northwest Permanente, where he also serves as regional clinical quality lead for COPD. Among his extensive research experience, he is a founding steering committee member of CONCERT and co-PI of the COPD Patient-Powered Research Network of the COPD Foundation. And our final panelist is Pam DiNardo. Pam is a COPD patient of 20 years and an advocate with the COPD Foundation in many positions since its inception. Along with Bill Clark and John Walsh, she started the COPD Foundation's information line in 2007. And like many here, she is a firm believer in the importance of research, but also knows that there are many misunderstandings among the patient population. So Richard and Pam, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. It's our pleasure. And I'd like to also echo the thank you to everyone joining us today and hope that you all get a chance to learn a lot. We'll do our best to avoid terms like PI that Barbara just used in my introduction. I'll tell you that means principal investigator. It's the person who's a senior investigator leading a study. And we hope to teach you a lot more things today. So let's get started, Barbara.
Thanks, Richard. I appreciate it. Next slide, please. So let's start out with sort of the obvious question. What is research? Richard, what is research?
So in the most broad terms, research is just using science to try to improve health. Medical research studies are designed to provide all kinds of different information about health, about prevention, about disease, and about disease management. There's many different types of study. Oh, go ahead.
No, and that's just what I was going to say and we have a lot of different kinds. Can you tell us a little bit more about each one of these that you see up there now?
Sure. So, you see the 4th one on there, clinical trials, is what lots of people think of research. That's when one treatment or medication is compared usually against something called the placebo, like a sugar pill or something that is known to not actually have any effect on, say, treating a disease like COPD. But there's all these other types of research: observational studies, epidemiological intervention, pragmatic effectiveness, implementation, prevention, and even others beyond these. But these are the main ones that we want to tell you a little bit about today because there's such a spectrum that folks can participate in and get involved in, and we'd like to make sure that there's some clarity around all of that.
Okay, well, let's go to the next slide where we have a few more details of each of these different kinds of studies. So, again, what do these big words like epidemiological and intervention mean? Richard, tell us a little bit about it, and then Pam and I may give some examples of studies we've worked on. But please, go ahead, Richard.
Sounds great. Well, let's start with the first one, observational studies. It basically just means they're studies where people are observing things. It's usually a group of people that might be, for instance, registrants like we have for our COPD patient-powered research network, or other sort of places where patients can gather at a particular health center, like the Framingham study that some people may have heard about in the news that's helped inform us about blood pressure and cholesterol that's been going since 1948, or ones where people actually reach out and ask folks to participate in things like surveys, filling out questionnaires, participating in focus groups, which I know Pam has done before. It's a chance to kind of have in-depth conversations with a small group of people and some researchers, or as I suggested, just joining a registry provides information that can be very helpful for scientists and help develop questions, hypotheses we call them, of things that might want to be studied in the future, as well as informing things that we can find out just by looking at the data of these surveys and other forms of information.
And this is a great way to perhaps kind of get your toe in the water, so to speak, because most of these studies, unlike the Framingham that's gone on for 70 plus years now, most of these studies are very short-lived. If you join the registry and you do one of the survey studies, it may take 5 minutes, it might take up to 30 minutes, but that's it. Pam, have you done some of those surveys on the registry?
Yes, I have. I've done several surveys. I've done focus groups, and I've joined the PPRN too. So, and that's been very helpful to me. I've gotten several emails from the PPRN regarding studies.
Right, and when you do this, go ahead, Pam.
I do agree that it's a good first step into the whole idea of research. I think it takes away a lot of fears that people have about research, and it gives them an idea of what they're going to learn and the benefits. There are benefits to research too. So I think it's a great way to start out.
I agree. And one of the things, of course, if you do one of these focus groups or surveys, one of the things you want to make sure is that you figure out how you can learn what the results were. And you need to kind of hold us researchers' feet to the fire, so to speak, and say, okay, this is great. I was happy to participate, but now what did you learn from these studies? And let us help you know what we did. How about, Richard, let's go on. What are the other two types here?
So epidemiological studies are kind of the same thing, but on a larger scale. These can be studies, for instance, using existing large databases, such as ones that the government might run, or surveys. For instance, the Center of Disease Control conducts a survey every 4 years and calls a set number of people in every state. And some of that census information, if you will, really helped all of us in the field of COPD learn about where COPD is, what its rates are, rates of smoking in different states, and really helps us to inform both policy decisions and to provide research that gives us associations, things that we can learn that go together, that really help us inform some of the other studies we'll talk about later.
Yeah, and some of those medical record review studies, those are some of the ones that I've done for many, many years, and extremely helpful when patients sign the little consent saying, yes, they agree to allow their medical record information to be used in approved studies. We'll talk about some of that approval in a minute, that assures that you will have some protections when a researcher uses your medical record data, for example. But let's go ahead and talk about the intervention, and then we're going to talk about patients' rights and things like that in general.
Sure. So intervention studies are another one that's kind of easy to get involved in. These are studies that are really meant to change behaviors. And so they could be anything from education to participating in a pulmonary rehab program, for instance, or some of the other examples that you see on the screen. They can be studies that are randomized, and we'll talk about what that means, like a clinical trial, or they can be using different sort of designs. But the gist is that they target behaviors of patients primarily that might affect health.
Right, and right now the PPRN actually has one that we will be enrolling patients for, that you will be given the opportunity to have a sensor that goes on your inhaler, and it links to an app, for example, and it lets you know when you used your medicine and when you didn't, when you forgot it. So we do these studies to see, does something like this sensor help the patients and their families improve your ability to remember and take your medication on a regular basis, or maybe wearing the pedometer, and does this help you get more activity in than if you're not wearing it? So a lot of these give you feedback too, along with giving the researchers information. Let's go on and talk a little bit more now in detail about clinical trials on the next slide, please.
So as the picture shows there, clinical trials are our strongest study design, if you will. It takes an idea, the hypothesis, and allows people to go into two groups in a way that's called randomized. Randomization is a way to help control the distribution of people into different arms of the trial. So randomization is basically like rolling a dice. Our patients don't get to choose, the doctors don't get to choose, the researchers don't get to choose, all to avoid confusing the possibility of really determining whether the intervention, the drug, for instance, if that's what you're tested, is having an effect. So that's a key part of these kind of studies. That design then, that randomization, allows us to really draw conclusions that something might be working or not working. So the classical clinical trials are those of developing new medicines. And we'll talk later about some of the regulation around this and how important it is for people who participate in these to really understand what they're getting into. There's a process called informed consent, which is really asking folks to consent to say that they'll be in the study because they really understand what's going on, recognizing also that at any time they can stop participating in the study. Now, these clinical trials, if you will, drug development, let's think about, often start in bench research, test tubes, if you will, and a substance might be developed and various things are done in those test tubes to understand, hey, this drug seems to have characteristics that might make it good for, say, treating shortness of breath in COPD. It then undergoes a lot of animal testing and eventually is deemed safe and potentially effective enough that it goes into these various phases of clinical trials. Those are when humans get involved. So phase 1 trials are really just designed for healthy volunteers, and it studies how the drug dose works in a person. How much drug do you need? How often do you have to take it? How is it broken down, for instance? And you get a little bit of data on safety, but really nothing about how well the drug might potentially perform in disease. Phase 2 studies are where usually several hundred volunteers who actually have the target condition, let's say COPD, start to use the drug, again, in an investigational manner, so we can see, does it have the desired effects? And then we learn more about the dosing and the safety. Phase 3 clinical trials are the ones that most people think of as the big research trials. And these are the ones where, as I suggested, people are randomized, usually to two different arms, the drug of interest and something else to compare it to, which is often that placebo, the sugar pill that isn't expected to do anything. And they can run for a couple of years and gather lots of data and eventually can answer the question, is this drug safe and effective or not? And that's the kind of trial that's required before a drug can, for instance, go to the FDA for approval and eventually marketing. Phase 4 trials are sometimes required by the FDA, or companies or other researchers will want to do it to look at what happens to the drug post-marketing, if you will, after it was approved and is being used in less controlled situations than that of a phase 3 clinical trial. So that's a lot of information. What more should we talk about, Barbara?
Well, I was going to ask Pam. Have you ever been in a clinical trial?
No, I've applied on several occasions, but I guess because of a couple of comorbidities I have, I was not eligible. But I would do it in a minute if I could. I'm going to keep trying. But it sounds
very an example of how rigorous these phase 3 trials are. There are a lot of things called inclusion and exclusion criteria. The inclusion is, what do you have to get in? So you might have to have COPD, but not just COPD, a certain severity of COPD, certain symptoms, certain other characteristics. And then there's all these exclusion criteria, as Pam suggests, things that they don't want in the mix that might muddy the water. For instance, like having asthma and COPD, since the purpose is to test in a very tightly controlled group of people the effectiveness of a drug.
Right. That was my problem, asthma and emphysema. They were doing an emphysema trial. So I was out.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a really good, but I think you also pointed out that there are, for some things, then these phase 4 trials. And Pam, you need to look for phase 4 trials if we can find some to suggest for you. But these are usually the studies where those inclusion and exclusion criteria change. The inclusion may stay the same. We still want people with COPD, but we aren't testing it so tightly. We want to know what happens out in the real world. So people that do have asthma and COPD might be included in a phase 4 trial where they weren't in a phase 3. So just to let everyone know that, yes, you may find it difficult to meet all the criteria for phase 3, but keep looking for those phase 4 trials. They're really important. Yeah.
I'm going to try, sure.
All right. So I think that those are important. We're going to talk a little bit more because I know people have a lot of concerns about sugar pills and other things like that. But I want to just touch on these other 2 types. And then we're going to go on in just a minute and talk more about patients' rights and what you need to ask about clinical trials. So the pragmatic studies, Richard, these are a little different, aren't they?
Yeah, so this is the work that I'm most interested in, and it's studies that can compare 2 different drugs, for instance. One of the famous ones was done here in Oregon, comparing, the purple pill omeprazole to the old-fashioned pill Pepcid to see if it actually had effectiveness, and that was done in a population where there were no restrictions, no exclusions, and the idea was to inform the Oregon Health Plan as to which drug might be better for their insurance coverage. Implementation studies are some of my favorites and ones that are easy for folks to participate in because these are really studies designed to have the delivery system, the doctors, the nurses, the hospitals, and the health system, provide care that's known to be effective, so there's very little risk, but to, study how it's delivered and how it might best work. So, for instance, a study of care management to see if patients get, better cocktails and medications or get to pulmonary rehab more often or other things are very interesting studies and, again, a great opportunity for people to participate. Pragmatic trials are really just trials where we're trying to take away many of the exclusions and have a more real-world sort of study. Some of these things are studies like Barbara has done in the primary care practices that she's been involved in.
Right, and they again are more like the things that Pam you may find you're able to become part of, because
Yes.
we do it in real world patients, because we know there aren't that many patients who have never smoked, never had asthma, never had high blood pressure, and sometimes it goes on and on and on. So these pragmatic studies may be of interest too. What about prevention studies?
Yeah, so prevention could use any of the designs that we've been talking about, but they're really studies that look at ways to keep people from getting sick. So again, they might be vaccines, or they could even be things like diet. And some of these can even target changes in behavior, much like the intervention studies that we were talking about before. It's just another type of study that you might hear about, and again, one that might be, easier for folks who don't have a lot of other diseases, or haven't really had the opportunity to participate in trials before.
Right, and there are, and these are adding big fancy words, but there's primary prevention studies. That would be how do we keep people from getting COPD? There are secondary prevention studies that are, okay, how do we keep people with COPD from maybe getting some comorbidity or some other condition like osteoporosis that's associated with COPD or depression? And then we have tertiary prevention studies, and those are studies where somebody has both the COPD perhaps and the osteoporosis or the depression, and we try to figure out how to improve the care of those combinations of things so they don't have even more problems. So lots of prevention studies, and you don't have to be totally healthy and without any problems to be in a prevention study. Let's go on to the next one, please. We really want to focus now a little bit on the registry that Richard told you about before. And this is the COPD PPRN registry. We have over 7,000 people who have already joined the registry, and you join by logging in, and you can see the login down there. And filling out some information about you and about your COPD or asthma or whatever it is, risk factors that you may have. And also then we would find out and ask you to fill out some surveys about how does your COPD affect your breathing, your activity, your mood, perhaps. Do you use oxygen? All of those kinds of questions are asked on a sort of baseline survey that we ask you to fill out. It takes a while. It takes about 15, 20, maybe even 30 minutes, and you can do it in different sessions. But once you're enrolled, then we have the opportunity to tell you about other surveys, such as the pulmonary rehab one and the medication survey that are available right now, or also about clinical trials that you might be interested in or might actually be able to do. So, Pam, tell us a little bit about it. I know you said you're part of the registry. How was it to enroll? Was it difficult?
No, it wasn't difficult to enroll. It does take about 20 minutes or so, but as you said, you can take a telephone call, walk away, come back and finish it too. Another thing I think that we need to stress is the privacy of all of these. That they are just incredibly private. No one will get your information except the people running the study. And I have received, I've been in a lot of focus groups and quite a few surveys and calls, telephone calls, and many of them came from the PPRN. The PPRN actually sends you an email. They don't send it to the person doing this, the group doing this study. They will send it to you. And then you get the chance to say yes or no. And if you say no, then it's over. So you don't have to worry about anybody calling you on that again. So it's,
yeah, and
it's a
I
wonderful
think
way.
Well, good. And I think that what you said about privacy is of concern to people. They, oh my goodness, I'm going to tell you all this information. But you need to know that this information is stored on very special computer servers that are protected in many ways, and no one has access to it. And I like what you just reminded us about is that if there is a study that's available, we don't send your information from the PPRN to the researchers. Instead, we ask the researchers to tell us and give us information that we can then give to people on the PPRN, and you then have an email or a phone number, and you, as the person on the registry, get to decide if you're going to call the researchers or not. And if you don't, that's just fine. That's totally your choice. So privacy is critically important to the COPD Foundation and our registry.
And no obligation to either. That made a big difference for me. I wasn't obligated to be on any particular study.
That's right. And you're not obligated to fill out any more surveys. We hope that you will fill out some of them, especially the baseline one, and then we send you one in about a year to see if things have changed. And we really appreciate people filling those out. But you don't have to do anything. You can just get on, look at your dashboard, and see if there's anything you're interested in. And if there isn't, that's fine. If there is, terrific. Let's go on to the next one now. We want to talk a little bit more about rights. And people on clinical trials, but on any kind of research, have rights. Richard, do you want to talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, I think this is really, really important. Clinical trials are highly regulated. They're not something that anybody can just, any researcher can start up willy-nilly. And one of the main things that you may hear about if you decide to participate in really any kind of research, even our registry, is that it's regulated by something called an institutional review board. And this is a requisite of every study. It's required that studies comply with many layers of review external to the research group to try to make sure that the study could actually answer a question, that it has safety precautions in place, that it has sound science and data collection, all things to protect the rights of people that might participate. Some of the key rights that are included in that is that although someone might go through the process of informed consent that we'll talk about shortly and decide to join the study, at any time they might want to, they can stop participating in the study. And moreover, besides that, if, for instance, somebody, one of our Kaiser members here in Portland, comes and joins, let's say, our valve study that we're engaged in, putting valves in people's airways, and they might start the study, they might get their baseline CAT scan and some pulmonary function tests, meet with us a couple times and fill out some surveys, and then let's say they actually get randomized to having that procedure done. They might say, now that I've heard and learned more and had my questions answered, I don't think that's for me. I don't want to participate in this study anymore. And that's entirely their right, and we're required to make sure it doesn't interfere with any of the other clinical care that we might provide somebody. So it's good to know those safeguards. Now, the other important thing for people to do is to make sure that they know what they're getting into. And Pam will talk about this, I think, a little bit more. But one of the key regulatory pieces is informed consent. Now, sometimes this, becomes a 20-page document that you have to read, and it can be challenging. But the informed consent really talks about a process, and it's the process of the research nurses and study coordinators and investigators making sure that anyone that wants to participate in a study can understand risks and benefits, the details of the study, how to contact folks, how to opt out later if they want to, before they actually sign and say, yes, I understand enough and I agree to be part of this study.
Yeah, and I think that those are really important. As you said, the informed consent can be rather long, but it's for a very good reason. And I did want to point out that for the Patient Powered Research Network, the studies that you will see listed up there have gone through all of these things, the Institutional Review Board, but they go through an extra step, and that is our Research Review Committee of the PPRN. And this is made up of primarily patients, and they actually review the study protocol and the informed consent and those kinds of things and decide, is this a study we think would be useful for our PPRN members? Do we think that it would give some value to either the members or to people in general? And one of the things that we always look for is whether or not patients have been involved in developing this study and will be involved in continuing to evaluate it as it goes on, not just as participants, but as members of the research committee. So any study you see on the PPRN website, like Tam commented on, has been reviewed an extra time by members of the COPD Foundation Research Review Committee and the PPRN Governing Board. So an extra layer there.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go on, because Pam, in a minute, I do want you to help us with the next slide, please. So why do you think people get involved in research? What are the benefits and things for people?
Well, I can tell you personally, for me, I've always believed that education is the one thing you need in order to slow the disease down, in order to live as long as you can for as well as you can. So that's the first thing, learn about your disease. And the clinical studies, when you talked about all the things you go through, you learn an awful lot. Even the focus groups, you'd be surprised. I always learn something when I do any of these things. And access to new information and resources. You're going to learn things about something coming down the pike that nobody else knows about. You might know that you may not know the name of this inhaler you're trying in the clinical trial, but you may know that it's going to be available. You can pretty much tell if it's doing well in your group, if your group's doing well. And let's do something for COPD research. You know, if we can't do it and we're all patients, then I don't know who we can expect to do the work. We have to get off our butts and we have to get out there and do some work. You know, these people, a lot of people are helping us. And I think patients need to get out there more and talk more about it. And let's help move it on, help ourselves, help my kids, my grandkids, and, you know, the next generation. And this access to new treatment and medical care. From everyone that I've talked to that's been in a clinical trial, they say it's phenomenal. The medical care they get is great. Obviously, their medicines are free. We all know how much medication for COPD costs, and they're not cheap. So there's another good reason to do it. I don't see any really bad reasons. And I think the only thing that might stop someone is the fact that they might think they're going to be stuck in that trial. And there's no way you'll be stuck in any of these clinical trials, the focus groups. You're just not going to be. You can always say no, and it's easy to do. So I think, you know, we gave you all kinds of ways to put your feet in the water and get them wet and see how it goes. And so try those things first if you want. But,
well, yes, I think that's really important. And the next slide, we really want to help people know what kind of questions to ask. And remember, you should ask lots of questions. The more questions you ask, the more likely you are to make the right decision for you and then find that you want to complete the study, whatever kind of study it is. So these are some of the questions. Pam, you want to go through a couple of them here?
Yeah, how long will you be in the study? That's a good one. Some of them are 3 months long. Some, the good doctor said the other day, some of them are 3 years long. Ooh, that's a long time, but you want to know that. Do you have to stop your current medication? This is a big fear to a lot of patients. They don't, let's say they're going along fine with the regimen they're on, and they're going to go into clinical trial and take a medication they don't know anything about. That makes them very nervous. But you can find out about it. You can when you're going through this, you can say, I'd like to take this information to my doctor before I make a decision whether I'm going to be in this clinical trial or not. That's fine. Nobody cares if you do that. It's a good thing to do anyway. And the doctor may give you more questions you might want to ask. So it's a good idea. You might have to travel, but
also we want to point out that a lot of these studies are adding a medication to what you're taking. And so
yes.
What you're taking may be working pretty well, but you're still having some problems. And so they will have you stay on all or most of your usual medicines, and we may be adding something, or we may be giving it to you in a different way. Maybe you've used an inhaler and now there is a very similar medication, but it's available, by nebulizer. So please ask these things, because I agree with you. I think a lot of patients are very fearful that I'm going to get in a clinical trial and they're going to take all my medicines away from me and I'm just going to have sugar pills. And
well, they do think that way.
Yeah, that's right. But that's not what happens in almost all clinical trials. But you won't know if you don't ask.
No.
So what else, Pam?
Who is paying for the research? That's interesting. How will you find out the results? That's something I would want to know. Are they going to just give us the results, or do we have to ask for them? You want to know that too.
Yeah.
I don't see. Yeah, the benefits. I think the benefits far outweigh any risks.
But I think everybody has to decide for themselves.
Sure.
For example, there may be travel involved, and you might have to be going someplace that's 60, 80 miles away. And for some people, that is really a big risk that outweighs any potential benefit, because that's just impossible for them to do. So you do want to know, are you going to have to travel? Will you be reimbursed for travel? What kind of travel? How often will you travel? How often do you have to go for study visits? Will you get more calls after you've finished the study? If you gave them blood during the study for testing, what will they do with that blood? Will the results stay there? If it's genetic testing, what are they going to do with your genetic information? And there are lots and lots of questions you may have, but a good study is going to have answers for all of these, and they're going to be happy that you ask them these questions.
I would think they'd have more. I would think they'd have more questions than even I do, and more answers than I have questions.
Well, I don't know. Sometimes people have more questions than I have answers for, but it's usually, I should have thought of that answer before, and I always appreciate it. So that's good. So, Richard, anything else that you suggest that we haven't had them ask here?
No, I think this covers it well, but it's worth, reiterating a couple things. By joining our COPD Patient-Powered Research Network, you get information about studies that have been vetted both through, our patient-led governing board and, by our group to try to help match what you do. And that will, I think, help get you to places where, you'll be able to then learn more about the studies and try to find ones that are a good fit and that make good sense for you to be a part of. And we hope you do that.
Right. And the next slide gives you some information about where you might go to look for studies that are in your area of the country, your region, maybe even your doctors or hospitals or whatever participate in. There's the clinicaltrials.gov, and the clinicaltrials.gov lists, and you can sort actually in there if you want to know about COPD studies. You can sort and look at the COPD studies both the ones that are completed, but the ones that are enrolling patients right now, sometimes they give you much more information than you may want to know in the beginning, but it's a good place to start. And then, as we've mentioned before, if you join the COPD Foundation PPRN, our Patient Powered Research Network, you will be sent emails about available studies. Sometimes we send it to everybody in the PPRN. For example, when we have a survey about medications or pulmonary rehab, but we also sometimes target those. For example, if we know we had a recent study where you had to be near a certain city in Florida, well, we really only sent the invitation out to people who live in that area, because it didn't make much sense to send it to people who live in Oregon or California. But you will get invitations. And then what Pam said is critically important. Those invitations give you the information, and you're the one that gets to call and say, yes, I want to know more, or decide, nope, this one's not for me, and that's the end of it. Excuse me. Next slide, please. I want to make sure that you do type your questions in, and I'm hoping if you haven't done it already, you'll do it while we go through this summary. So there are many ways to participate and contribute to research, and we hope that you will take advantage of some of those and starting wherever you want to, with maybe the surveys or something like that, joining the registry. Later then working up to the clinical trial, or maybe you're ready to go right to the clinical trial, whatever's appropriate. Be sure before you do sign the informed consent and agree to a study that you ask the key questions. All of those things we listed and more that you can probably think of should be answered before you're ready to sign. Make sure that you know all the risks and benefits. Also realize that you can stop any study at any time, from, filling out half the survey and deciding, I don't want to do this, I don't like this. Okay, stop. Or if they're in a clinical trial, like Richard said, and you get almost ready to do whatever part of the study and you say, nope, I don't want to do anymore, that's your right to stop, and your medical care will not be affected. And also, please remember that joining the PPRN is probably a really easy way to become part of COPD research. And now, do we have some questions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Yan and Dr. Malarski and Pam. We do have a few questions from some of the participants today.
Great.
One to me, and I don't remember all of the types of research, etc. Will the researcher or doctor explain everything I am about to do before I begin?
Why don't I take one? Sure, because that's really, really important. And if you're not feeling like you're getting everything explained, as Barbara and Pam both emphasized, keep asking questions.
Sure.
The informed consent process really is there to make sure that all those questions are answered and that you understand all the details of the study, what kind of tests you may get as part of it, how long it's going to run, and what's expected of you and what's expected of the people that are running the study.
Mm-hmm. And remember, the amount of time somebody spends explaining the study is often related to the potential risks of that study. For example, if we're asking you to answer 6 questions online, then we're not going to spend hours explaining all the risks and benefits, but want to make sure you understand about privacy, for example, which is people's biggest concern probably with an online survey. On the other hand, if this involves something like Richard was talking about with inserting a valve in your airways, then this informed consent process is going to take a lot longer, and you're going to ask a lot more questions. What else do we have?
Should I always talk to my doctor before I decide to join a study?
Well, again, I think it depends on what the study is. If it's a survey and things like that, I don't think you have to talk to your doctor about that. But if it is something that's going to change your medication, or there's something like the valve involved, then I would certainly like to know, if I were your doctor, that you're participating in this. And I might have some ability to help you make a decision. Pam, what do you think? Would you always tell your doctor?
The only time that I've done that is when I questioned my ability to make the right answer. And so I went to the doctor, and he was fine with it, and we discussed it, and I was really glad that we did. I would have no problem going to ask my doctor, no.
Yeah,
and that's a good point, Pam. Even if you feel comfortable making the decision and joining a study, it's always good to let your doctor know after you're a part of it, just so that they're aware.
Sure.
And if that affects any of the care that they're providing, it's good to know.
Right.
Right, because as a primary care doctor, you may start the study because you saw your pulmonologist, but you're going to come and see me for other things, whether it's your sore throat or, your blood pressure or whatever. I would really like to know that you're in the study. And if you're getting a study medicine, I'd love to have you bring that in. I can put in my chart, too, that you're part of a study and that this is what you're taking.
Yeah, I think you can't go wrong without, talking to your doctor. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. We're going to take one more, and then I just want to let the audience know, if we did not get to your question, we will be posting the questions and the answers on COPD 360 social. Someone would like to know, where are we with stem cell trials?
Richard, you want to try that? No.
I know that's
Sure.
a little complicated.
Yeah, it's also very controversial, and so I will give my opinion, which is, at this point, especially in COPD, there really aren't any legitimate candidates of stem cell to be doing research on, and unfortunately, there's been many reports, especially people going to different countries, of having very dangerous treatments and very unfortunate outcomes by seeking the stem cell. I think there is research that the National Institute of Health is supporting, and there may be good candidates for stem cell research in the future for COPD, but right now it's really isolated to a few rare genetic and childhood congenital conditions for that research.
And I'm going to just echo that and say, please, if you are considering stem cell anything, talk with your doctor. Make sure it is only for COPD, and if it is in the setting of a research by a legitimate research group, an academic medical center, hopefully, or NIH at their campus, and that you really understand who is paying for and supporting this research. And it should not ever be considered, in my opinion, outside of a research setting at this time. It's just too many bad things have happened to too many people that I don't think we can emphasize that strongly enough. I hope it's going to work at some point in time, but it's not quite ready. Well, it's not nearly ready for prime time yet. Pam, you want to say anything?
No, we do. When we were on the information line, we got a lot of calls from people who had tried stem cell therapy or were going to try those clinics. Some of them have actually been shut down now. but they were all phony. You know, they took tens of thousands of dollars from those patients, and the patients did not get better. So yeah, I would be sure I was getting I was at the right place and at the right time, and that everything was good before I plunked down $10,000 for an injection. So.
Well, and I think that most of the time, that if you're in a research study, you don't pay to be in a research study. They may reimburse you for your time, but they don't ask you to pay to be in a research study. That's a great first way to say, whoa, this doesn't sound like research.
Right. Yeah. It's a shame because there's a lot of people who really want to get better quickly, and they're just getting flim-flam from these people. It's a scam. I know. It's sad.
All right. Kristen.
Okay. I just wanted to say thank you again to Dr. Jan, Dr. Malarski, and Pam. And we thank you all for your time and attention this afternoon and hope this webinar was informative. For those attending today's webinar, you will receive a brief survey in a follow-up email along with the one-page handout about research along with the slides that were shown today. We plan to conduct additional educational webinars in the future, so we really appreciate your feedback in order to tailor these to your needs. So thank you again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone. I agree. And please do fill out the evaluation. It really helps us with future webinars.